Today we'll be covering the new Druid archetype called the Druid of the Circle of Spores. An archetype we really weren't expecting, as it appears primarily in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, a book separate from the player's handbook. But in retrospect, the archetype really suits the game, as we already know we'll be engaging in copious exploration of the Underdark, as well as other underground environments that are home to all manner of fungi and spore-like things and creatures. Personally, I find this archetype to be the most interesting of the ones revealed from an RPG sense, so let's launch into it. Now, the Circle of Spores Druid is a bit of a darker take on Druids in general. Although still interested in balance, they ultimately are as fascinated by decay and rot as they are with the former, and they specialize in transforming lifeless matter into strange new life. Death is a transitional state that leads back to life, and such Druids even see a purpose for the undead, something that is normally anathema to a standard Druid. To them, undeath occupies an in-between realm, between life and death, and it has its place, and therefore undeath, when extended for too long, can be problematic. And in this sense, a Spores Druid would be opposed to sentient undead that seek to exist perpetually, such as vampires and liches, and such undead are ruthlessly hunted down. Given all of this, the Spores Druid has abilities that might seem strange to your standard Druid, and those familiar with the normal Druid. But here they are. The Druid of the Circle of Spores has access to spells that are related to decay, fungus, and darkness, which makes them, depending on your view, a lot more interesting than all the other archetypes. Their spore spells focus on the circle of life and death. At second level, the Druid of the Circle of Spores gains the Chill Touch cantrip. At third level, the Druid gains Blindness, Deafness, and Gentle Repose. At fifth level, the Druid gains Animate Dead and Gaseous Form. At seventh level, the Druid gains Blight and Confusion, and finally at ninth level, the Druid gains Cloud Kill and Contagion. Such spells are always prepared, and don't count against the total number of spells that the Druid can prepare per day. In addition to this, the Circle of Spores Druid gets some very cool abilities that really sync well with their role-playing aspects. At second level, the Druid acquires the Halo of Spores ability, an invisible aura of necrotic spores that cling to the Druid until the Druid decides to release them upon a nearby opponent. When a creature enters within 10 feet of the Druid can use their reaction to deal 1 die 4 necrotic damage to the creature, unless it succeeds on a Constitution saving throw against the Druid's spell DC. The damage of this ability increases to 1 die 6 at 6th level and 1 die 8 at 10th. Additionally, at 2nd level, the Druid gains Symbiotic Entity and can channel magic into their spores. The Druid can use an action to expend a use of Wild Shape to instead awaken spores, which give them 4 temporary hit points for each level of Druid that the Druid has in the Druid class. As long as this is active, when the Druid does damage, and the Druid uses Halo of Spores, the Druid can roll damage die a second time and add it to the total, and the Druid's weapon attacks deal an extra 1 die 6 necrotic damage to any target they hit. At 6th level, the Druid gains the Fungal Infestation ability, and can infest a corpse and animate it. If a beast or small or medium humanoid dies within 10 feet of the Druid can use the reaction to animate it immediately, and it stands up with 1 hit point. The creature has the stats of a zombie, and remains animate for an hour if not destroyed, after which it collapses and dies. It obeys the Druid's commands to the best of its abilities, and can only take 1 attack action, making a single melee attack. And this ability can be used a number of times equal to the Druid's Wisdom score bonus. At 10th level, the Circle of Spores Druid gains the Spreading Spores ability, which allows them to use their spores in area effect up to 30 feet away, which then swirl about in a 10-foot cube for 1 minute. The spores disappear early if this feature is used again, or if they are dismissed as a bonus action, or if the Druid's Symbiotic Entity feature is no longer active. Whenever a creature moves into the cube, or begins its turn there, the creature takes the Druid's Halo Spores damage unless it succeeds on a Constitution saving throw against the Druid's spell DC. This damage can only be applied once per turn, and as long as the cube of spores persists, the Halo of Spores ability cannot be used as a reaction. Now, the Circle of Spores Druid is a Druid archetype with a lot of flavor, And there's no denying that. Considering we have no fewer than 3 Underdark races, Deep Gnomes, Drow, and Duergar, all these would make excellent candidates for the Circle of Spores Druid, at least from a role-playing perspective. It's a different story entirely in terms of stats, as none of these races gain attribute stat bonuses to Wisdom, which are essential for Druids, but depending on the difficulty you're playing, and your willingness to forego power gaming on your character, something difficult to do at times, I know, you may decide to play one of these races regardless. A half-drow, half-elf would be another nice option and a nice compromise, which would also allow you to keep the flavor of the archetype intact. So in the RPG sense, I think this archetype wins hands down of all the Druids. But does it beat out the other Druid archetypes in terms of combat, which is basically the meat and drink of the game? That's difficult to say. But I think unfortunately that the Circle of Spores Druid ranks somewhat worse than both the Circle of the Moon and the Circle of the Land, depending on its implementation and depending on what spells are available to the Circle of Land upon full release. Fungal Infestation Zombie is incredibly weak with just 1 hit point and a single melee attack, for example. On the other hand, Symbiotic Entity provides a great deal of extra hit points, which are always good for survival, but as just mentioned, all of this ultimately depends on how the archetype is introduced in the full game, and it's possible some things might be tweaked more positively, such as Fungal Infestation. And what about you? Are you looking forward to playing a Druid of the Circle of Spores? Do let me know in the comment section. And before I go, I'd like to invite you to my Discord server, where you can discuss Baldur's Gate 3 with like-minded people, as well as other RPGs. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and if you could leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, it'd be much appreciated, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.